The courtroom felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes every breath sound like a confession. The benches were full, yet no one shifted. No one coughed. Papers rested untouched on polished wood, as if even they were waiting for permission to move. My husband leaned toward me, close enough that I could smell his cologne, the one he only wore when he expected to win. His voice was low, almost kind. "We're safe." He said it like a promise, like a fact already settled. Across the aisle, the woman sitting beside him crossed her legs and smiled. Not at me, at the future. Her shoulders were loose, her posture relaxed, the way people sit when nothing is at risk. She didn't look like someone facing a judge. She looked like someone waiting for paperwork to be stamped. Behind them, his family sat in a neat row, calm and unbothered. No tension, no fear. This was routine for them. A process, a formality. I said nothing. At the front of the room, the judge opened the file. He didn't skim. He didn't flip pages quickly the way judges do when they already know where they're going. He read slowly, carefully. The silence stretched, grew heavy, started to feel wrong. I watched my husband's confidence linger just a second too long. Then the judge paused, lifted his eyes from the file, and looked straight ahead. That was the moment I knew they had miscalculated. I had learned, long before that day, that people reveal the most about themselves when they believe the outcome is guaranteed. Confidence makes them careless. Certainty makes them loud. And silence, real silence, unsettles those who expect applause or defeat. Sitting there, hands folded in my lap, I felt none of the panic they had assigned to me. No trembling, no tears. Just a steady awareness of the room, the way the air shifted when power began to move. This wasn't just a divorce. That had become clear weeks ago. Divorce was the surface story, the one they planned to sell. Underneath it was something heavier, something they believed would stay buried if they moved fast enough and spoke confidently enough. They had designed this day for me. The seating made that obvious. I was alone at my table. My attorney deliberately placed a half step back, letting the optics speak for themselves. Across from us, my husband's legal team spread out comfortably, laptops open, files stacked with the ease of people who had rehearsed this performance. His family sat close behind him, a visual reminder of resources and unity. The woman beside him leaned in now and then, whispering something that made him nod. He didn't look at me again. In his mind, I was already behind him. The judge adjusted the file, turned one page back, then another forward, as if confirming something twice. I felt it then, a subtle tightening in the room, the way even confident people sense when a current shifts beneath their feet. The woman's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning, thinner this time. My husband straightened in his chair, a reflex he probably didn't notice himself. His lawyer cleared his throat, ready to begin, ready to steer the narrative back onto familiar ground. I kept my eyes forward. People think silence means emptiness. It doesn't. Silence is often where the most preparation lives. I had spent years perfecting it, learning when to speak and when to let others assume they understood me. In that courtroom, they saw what they wanted to see. A wife pushed aside, a woman without leverage, someone who would accept whatever terms were placed in front of her just to make the discomfort end. They had mistaken my restraint for weakness. The judge looked down again, tracing a line of text with his finger. His expression wasn't angry. It wasn't amused. It was thoughtful, the kind of expression that appears when something doesn't fit the story presented. My husband shifted, just slightly, and glanced at his lawyer. The movement was small, but it was the first crack. I thought about how confident he had been the night before, how easily he spoke about the future as if it were already written. I thought about the conversations that had stopped when I entered rooms, the documents that had disappeared from shared folders, the way decisions had been announced to me instead of discussed. All of it had led here. The judge closed the file, then opened it again to a marked page. He took off his glasses, set them carefully on the bench, and finally looked directly at my husband. No ruling yet, no gavel, just attention. In that pause, the room changed. The certainty they brought with them began to drain away, replaced by something sharper and far more dangerous. They believed this case was over before it began. They were wrong. The judge's silence stretched on, heavy and deliberate, and as I sat there I realized how familiar that feeling was. Being present but unseen. Being close to power without ever being considered part of it. I had felt that way long before I ever stepped into a courtroom. Years earlier, when I first married my husband, I thought I was entering a partnership, not the kind built on grand romance, but something steadier, respectable. We looked good together. He was composed, articulate, already comfortable being listened to. I was efficient, observant, the kind of person who noticed what others missed and quietly fixed problems before they became visible. From the outside, it worked. From the inside, I began adjusting myself in small, almost invisible ways. I learned when to speak and when to pause. I learned how to soften my opinions so they sounded supportive instead of challenging. He never asked me to do this outright. He didn't have to. His confidence filled every space, and I stepped back without realizing I was doing it. His family reinforced that pattern early on. They were polite when we first met, impeccably so. Conversations felt rehearsed, questions phrased like compliments but carrying weight beneath them. They asked about my background, my work, my values, not with curiosity but with calculation. I smiled, answered carefully, and told myself this was just how accomplished families operated. They spoke often about legacy, about continuity, about protecting what had been built. I listened, nodded, and assumed marriage meant inclusion. That belief didn't last long. At gatherings, decisions were discussed in low voices just out of my reach. When I joined conversations, the subject shifted. Not abruptly, not rudely, just enough to remind me where the boundary was. I was included in the room, but not in the outcome. I told myself it was temporary. That trust took time. My husband never seemed to notice, or if he did, he didn't consider it a problem. He would summarize decisions for me later, casually, as if filling me in was the same as involving me. When I asked questions, he smiled and told me I was overthinking things. He said I worried too much about details that didn't matter. The irony of that didn't occur to me until much later. Gradually, my role became clear. I organized, I smoothed, I handled logistics and timing and presentation. I made sure everything ran seamlessly so that he could focus on being visible. When people complimented him, he accepted it easily. When they praised me, it was always for being supportive, adaptable, low maintenance. Low maintenance became a badge of honor I wore without realizing it was also a leash. The language around me changed slowly enough that I barely noticed. We became, he decided. My suggestions became background noise, acknowledged with nods but rarely acted on. When I expressed concern, I was told I was sensitive. When I pushed back, I was reminded that harmony mattered. I wanted harmony. I wanted to belong. There was a moment, early on, that should have stopped me cold. We were at a family dinner, seated around a long table polished to a shine. Someone mentioned a future plan, something significant, and I offered an idea. The table went quiet for a beat too long. Then his mother smiled at me and said gently that those matters were already being handled. No one met my eyes. Afterward, my husband told me not to read into it. He said his family just liked things done a certain way. He said I was taking it personally when it wasn't meant that way at all. I believed him. Or maybe I needed to. I learned to shrink my questions, to ask them privately instead of publicly. I learned that praise came when I stayed agreeable. Approval came when I didn't insist on being seen. Each small concession felt reasonable on its own. Together they erased me. There were signs, of course, conversations that stopped when I entered a room, documents that were quickly folded or closed, a look exchanged between two people that had nothing to do with me, yet involved me entirely. When I mentioned these things, I was reassured with practiced calm. You're imagining it. You're tired. You worry too much. I started believing that too. What I didn't understand then was that invisibility isn't accidental in families like his. It's curated. Silence is rewarded. Compliance is praised. And the person who adapts the fastest is the easiest to move later. Sitting in that courtroom years afterward, watching my husband sit with the same relaxed certainty he always carried, I recognized the pattern with painful clarity. They still saw me the same way they always had. Quiet, manageable, unthreatening. They believed I would accept the version of myself they had created. That belief had guided every choice they made. It was why they spoke freely around me, why they planned without fear, why they never considered that I might be paying attention. I had spent years learning how to disappear in plain sight. What they never understood was that disappearing teaches you exactly where everyone else stands. They called it the family business, but from the beginning it was clear that family meant blood, not marriage. Still, when my husband spoke about it in those early years, he used the word ours so naturally that I never thought to question it. It started with small things, reading drafts before meetings, organizing schedules when deals overlapped, catching inconsistencies in documents and quietly flagging them so someone else could take credit for fixing them. I was good at it, and they noticed, just not in the way that mattered. Praise came wrapped in reassurance. You're so reliable. You have such a good eye. We don't know what we'd do without you. What they never said was where I stood. The structure of the business was deliberately opaque, trusts layered over entities, entities nested inside partnerships, ownership described in vague, comforting language. Whenever I asked how things were set up, the answers were always broad and soothing. It's complicated. It's handled. You don't need to worry about that. My husband echoed those sentiments at home, telling me he wanted to spare me the stress. I told myself that transparency would come later, once I'd proven myself indispensable. Instead, the more I contributed, the less visible I became. Meetings happened without me. Decisions were finalized before I heard about them. I was asked to review materials after the fact, not before. When I pointed out potential issues, my comments were reframed as helpful suggestions rather than concerns. I learned to phrase everything carefully, to make sure my input sounded like support instead of scrutiny. They liked me best when I didn't ask what I was supporting. There was a moment, about a year into my involvement, when I first noticed how intentional the exclusion was. A document had been left on the dining table overnight, likely forgotten in the rush of a late call. I recognized the formatting immediately, legal language, dense and precise. I skimmed it before my husband came downstairs. My name wasn't there. The document outlined roles, protections, contingencies. Spouses were mentioned only once, in a clause that limited access and authority. I felt a tightness in my chest as I read it again, slower this time, hoping I'd missed something. I hadn't. When I asked my husband about it later casually, he didn't seem surprised. He smiled and told me that was just how his family did things. Nothing personal, just practical. He said it protected everyone, including him. I wanted to push harder. I didn't. Instead, I nodded and told myself that marriage was stronger than paperwork. That trust mattered more than signatures. That love filled in the gaps law created. That belief cost me years. The business grew. So did the demands on my time. I handled more, smoothed more, compensated more. When problems arose, I was brought in quietly to fix them, then ushered back out of sight once they were resolved. I was useful, not powerful, trusted, but not protected. The language they used around me became more revealing as time went on. They talked about risk and exposure, about maintaining control and avoiding disruption. My role, unstated but clear, was to ensure nothing disrupted the flow. Not my questions, not my needs, certainly not my presence. At events, I was introduced as his wife, nothing more. Never as a contributor, never as someone with insight. When people asked what I did, answers were vague. I smiled through it, even as something inside me began to harden. There were warnings I ignored. An accountant who hesitated before answering one of my questions, then suggested I talk to my husband instead. A lawyer who addressed explanations to him even when I asked directly. A family member who once said, half joking, that I was lucky not to have to worry about ownership. Lucky. By the time I realized that my lack of documentation wasn't an oversight but a feature, the pattern was firmly in place. The business wasn't built to include me. It was built to function without me, no matter how much I contributed. What frightened me most wasn't the exclusion itself. It was how normal it felt to everyone else. They weren't hiding things in a rush or out of fear. They were hiding them calmly, confidently, as if there was no scenario in which I would ever challenge the structure. They believed marriage had neutralized me, that my loyalty made me predictable. In hindsight, I understand why the affair came later. The groundwork for my removal was already laid. The mistress wasn't the beginning of the betrayal. She was the solution to a problem they had been managing quietly for years. Sitting at home one evening, reviewing notes for a meeting I wouldn't attend, I caught my reflection in the darkened window. I looked composed, capable, invisible. And for the first time, I felt the weight of what that invisibility meant. If something went wrong, I would have nothing to stand on, no paper trail, no acknowledgement, no place in the story they were telling about their success. The family business had never been mine. I had just been keeping it alive long enough for them to decide they no longer needed me. She appeared at a dinner I hadn't been told to prepare for. It was one of those gatherings his family liked to host without much notice, where the table was set quickly, the wine already breathing by the time guests arrived. I remember stepping into the living room and seeing her standing near the fireplace, speaking softly to his mother as if they'd known each other for years. She turned when she heard my footsteps, her smile calm and measured. Not curious, not apologetic. Comfortable. The kind of comfort that doesn't ask permission. "This is Lena," my husband said almost casually. "She's been helping us with a few things." Helping us. The word landed strangely. I waited for more, for context, for an explanation that placed her somewhere harmless. None came. His mother greeted her warmly, touching her arm as she spoke. His sister leaned in, laughing at something Lena said under her breath. Inside jokes passed across the room like a language I didn't speak. I realized with a quiet jolt that I was the only one meeting her for the first time. During dinner, Lena was asked questions I had never been asked. About strategy, about long-term planning, about ideas for the future. She answered thoughtfully, never overreaching, never hesitating. When she spoke, people listened. When I added a comment, it drifted past unnoticed. At one point, she stood beside my husband, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. No one remarked on it. No one corrected the picture it painted. I watched his posture adjust subtly toward her, the way people lean toward what they value. I told myself it was professional. I told myself I was being sensitive. That had become a familiar refrain. Later that evening, as plates were cleared and conversations fractured into smaller groups, I found myself standing alone near the doorway, observing. Lena had seamlessly positioned herself at the center of the room, engaged, included, already essential. She didn't glance at me once. What unsettled me wasn't jealousy. It was recognition. She was occupying a space I had never been allowed to enter. On the drive home, I asked my husband about her. Lightly, casually. He didn't tense. He didn't stumble. He explained that she was useful right now, that she had a particular skill set the family appreciated. He said I was imagining things when I mentioned how close she seemed to everyone. "You're reading too much into it," he said. "She's just filling a gap." I didn't ask which gap. Over the next few weeks, Lena's presence became routine. She appeared at meetings I wasn't invited to. Her name surfaced in conversations about plans that extended far beyond anything I had been consulted on. When I entered rooms, conversations didn't stop anymore. They simply continued without me. One afternoon, I overheard his sister mention Lena's schedule in passing, referencing commitments weeks out. It struck me then that Lena hadn't arrived late to anything. I had. The shift in the family's behavior toward me was subtle but unmistakable. Politeness cooled into distance. Invitations became optional, then rare. When I spoke, responses were brief, courteous, final. I was no longer being evaluated. I was being phased out. There was a moment that clarified everything. We were at another gathering, this one larger, more formal. As people settled in, someone suggested a seating change to accommodate the evening's flow. Without hesitation, Lena was placed beside my husband. I was directed a few seats down, separated by conversation and glassware. No one looked at me as it happened. No one asked if it was all right. I sat there, hands folded, face composed, feeling something sharp and cold settle in my chest. This wasn't oversight. This was rehearsal. Afterward, in the quiet of our bedroom, I brought it up again, this time more directly. My husband sighed, the sound heavy with practiced patience. He told me I was being dramatic, that I was projecting insecurity where none existed, that Lena's role was temporary, and I needed to stop seeing threats where there were only solutions. Solutions? To what? He didn't say. I lay awake that night replaying conversations, glances, the way Lena never once acknowledged me as competition or concern. She behaved like someone who knew her place was secure, like someone who had already been chosen. The first real sign that this had been planned came a few days later. I was reviewing a shared calendar when I noticed Lena's name attached to an entry months in advance, labeled simply as transition. No explanation. No invitation to ask. When I mentioned it, my husband barely glanced at the screen before telling me it was nothing I needed to worry about. That was when it became clear. Affairs happen in secret. Replacements happen in plain sight. Lena wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness. She was positioned carefully, introduced gradually, accepted smoothly. While I had been making myself smaller to preserve harmony, she had been stepping into the space I vacated without protest. By the time I understood what was happening, the room had already rearranged itself around me. I wasn't being betrayed in whispers. I was being replaced in full view by people who assumed I would never object loudly enough to matter. And as I sat there, invisible among familiar faces, one question began to form, slow and steady, refusing to be ignored. If she was being prepared to take my place, what exactly was being taken from me? The house stopped feeling like mine long before anyone said it out loud. It wasn't dramatic at first, no shouting, no slammed doors, just small, deliberate changes that accumulated until every room felt slightly off, like furniture shifted an inch to the left when you weren't looking, a drawer that no longer opened smoothly, a cabinet reorganized without asking, files moved from the desk where I always kept them to somewhere I couldn't immediately find. At first, I told myself I was being territorial, emotional. That word followed me everywhere by then. Family dinners grew quieter around me. Conversations paused when I entered, then resumed with polite efficiency, as if I'd missed the part that mattered. Decisions were no longer discussed. They were announced, plans made elsewhere and delivered to me like updates I was expected to absorb without comment. Lena was always there, not hovering, not intrusive, just present. She moved through the house with ease, as if she already knew where everything belonged. She made suggestions casually, and they were accepted without debate. When she spoke, people leaned in. When I spoke, they nodded and moved on. The first direct humiliation came on a Sunday afternoon. We were sitting in the living room when my husband's brother brought up a change to the property, something structural, something permanent. I opened my mouth to ask a question, a reasonable one, about timing and cost. Before I could finish the sentence, his mother answered for me. "That's already been decided," she said pleasantly. "It makes the most sense." No one looked at me, not even my husband. I felt heat rise to my face, but I kept my expression neutral. I had learned that reacting only confirmed the version of me they preferred to believe in. Sensitive, difficult, out of step. Later that evening, one of his aunts pulled me aside. Her voice was soft, almost kind. She told me that families like theirs valued unity, that it was important not to create friction during periods of transition. She didn't say what the transition was. She didn't have to. The message was clear. Cooperate, and things might go smoothly. Resist, and you'd regret it. The house itself became part of the strategy after that. Rooms I used regularly were suddenly off limits because someone else needed them. Documents I relied on disappeared, replaced by locked cabinets and vague explanations. Lena began suggesting changes openly, commenting on layouts, on efficiency, on how spaces could be improved. And those changes happened. No one asked what I thought. My silence was interpreted as agreement. The first time I felt afraid wasn't during an argument or a confrontation. It was one quiet afternoon when I realized I didn't have a single ally inside those walls. Not one person who would speak up for me if things turned ugly. The fear wasn't physical. It was deeper than that. I was being erased carefully. Love had stopped protecting me. Marriage had stopped meaning anything tangible. The structures I assumed would hold me in place were being dismantled piece by piece, quietly enough that I was expected not to notice. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen, I overheard Lena and my husband talking in low voices in the next room. They weren't arguing, they were coordinating, discussing timing, logistics, what made sense going forward. I caught my name once, spoken like a variable, not a person. I stepped away before they noticed me listening. That night, I lay awake replaying everything I had ignored. Every moment I'd been told not to worry. Every time I'd been encouraged to be flexible, understanding, patient. Those words took on a different meaning now. They weren't meant to soothe me. They were meant to prepare me. The warning I should have understood sooner came from someone outside the family. A distant acquaintance, a lawyer who had crossed paths with my husband professionally, mentioned casually over coffee that things were moving fast. Too fast. He suggested, carefully, that I make sure I was protected. Protected how, he didn't say. He didn't need to. I went home that day with a knot in my stomach that wouldn't loosen. I walked through the house slowly, touching familiar surfaces, realizing how little of it was actually mine in any way that mattered. No documents with my name, no authority, no acknowledgement, just memories and expectations. By then, the house wasn't turning against me. It had already decided I didn't belong. I was living in a place that looked like home but functioned like neutral territory, controlled by people who were waiting for me to step aside gracefully. They believed I would. They believed I would pack quietly, accept whatever terms were offered, and disappear without causing inconvenience. That belief shaped everything they did. It made them bold. It made them careless. Standing alone in the living room that evening, listening to the muted sounds of a family that no longer included me, I felt something shift. Not anger, not despair, clarity. If they could remove me from my own home so efficiently, then this wasn't about feelings anymore. It wasn't even about betrayal. It was about power and the assumption that I had none. They were planning to take more than my marriage, more than my place in the family. And for the first time, I understood that staying silent without a plan wasn't grace. It was surrender. Something stopped adding up, and once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. The house had taken on a strange rhythm, one I hadn't felt before. Papers appeared and disappeared with intention. Conversations moved behind closed doors more often, voices dropping the moment I came close. There was a quiet urgency in the air that didn't match daily life, like people preparing for a storm they were certain I wouldn't notice. I stopped asking questions. I had learned that betrayal is loud. Strategy is quiet. The first real change was the language. Words I'd never heard spoken in our home before began slipping into casual conversation. Exposure, liability, risk. My husband used them the way someone might discuss a plumbing issue, detached and technical, as if our shared life were a system that needed adjusting. He spoke carefully, choosing phrases that sounded reasonable, responsible. When I looked at him, I saw not a man wrestling with guilt, but someone managing a process. Lena listened when he spoke like that. She didn't interrupt, she didn't need to. Her eyes tracked everything, the way someone does when they're collecting information, not emotions. That was when I realized she wasn't there for comfort or affection. She was there for alignment. The moment that truly frightened me came on an ordinary afternoon. I was clearing the dining table when I noticed a folder tucked beneath a stack of mail. It wasn't hidden, just misplaced enough that I knew it wasn't meant for me. The paper inside was heavier than usual, the formatting unmistakable. Legal. I skimmed before my brain could catch up with my hands. My name appeared once in a section that described limitations, not rights. The language was clinical and precise, outlining interests that were separate, non-contributing, protected from interference, protected from me. My chest tightened as I read it again, slower this time. The document wasn't about the future. It was about containment, about framing me as a variable to be managed, not a partner to be consulted. I put the folder back exactly where I found it and washed my hands, though they weren't dirty. I needed the routine, the normalcy, before fear took root. That evening I tested the ground carefully. I asked a neutral question, my tone light, about some paperwork I'd seen referenced earlier. My husband didn't hesitate. He answered smoothly, too smoothly, as if he'd rehearsed the explanation. He smiled, told me there was nothing to worry about, that these things were standard. Lena glanced up for a fraction of a second when I spoke. Her attention sharpened, then relaxed. They had expected this question. That was when certainty replaced fear. A few days later, I overheard a conversation I was never meant to hear. I'd stepped back into the hallway to grab my phone when I caught my name, spoken without hesitation, without concern for tone. My husband was talking about timing, about making sure everything was in place before things became complicated. Before she realizes, he said. The words landed cleanly. No ambiguity, no misunderstanding. I wasn't being left behind accidentally. I was being planned around. I stood there longer than I should have, listening as they discussed contingencies, legal positioning, the importance of keeping things calm. I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt awake. They weren't reacting to me. They were preparing for me. That distinction changed everything. I didn't confront them. Confrontation would have warned them. It would have shifted their timeline, made them more careful. Emotion would have cost me leverage, and I could feel how precious leverage was becoming. So I swallowed my anger and chose silence. For the first time, it wasn't the silence of accommodation. It was deliberate, strategic. I let them believe their narrative had settled. I let them assume I was overwhelmed, confused, resigned. Isolation, I realized then, is dangerous only if you don't understand it. Once you do, it becomes clarifying. I had no advocate inside that house. No one was going to question the version of events forming around me. That meant I couldn't rely on appeals to fairness or memory. I had to rely on facts. I began to watch with intention. Who spoke first? Who deferred? Who avoided eye contact when certain topics came up? I noticed the moments when confidence faltered, when someone corrected themselves too quickly or checked Lena's expression before answering. There were cracks, small ones. But they were there. I started keeping notes, mentally at first, then carefully, privately, dates, phrases, inconsistencies. I didn't know yet what I would need, only that I would need something. The house felt different after that. Not hostile, not comforting, just exposed, like a stage set where I could finally see the ropes holding the scenery in place. The fear I'd been carrying sharpened into focus, and focus gave me control. That was the day I stopped being naive. Not because I lost hope, but because I understood the game I was being forced to play. They had been building a case against me for months, maybe longer. They believed I was too quiet, too loyal, too invisible to fight back. Standing alone in the kitchen that night, listening to the low hum of conversations that no longer included me, I made a decision they never anticipated. If they were already preparing to defeat me, then my survival depended on learning everything they assumed I never would. And this time, I would be ready before they realized I'd started paying attention. I stopped defending myself the moment I understood what defending actually gave them. Every explanation I'd offered before, every attempt to clarify or correct, had been taken as data. They learned how I thought, what worried me, where I softened. Silence, I realized, took that advantage away. Silence forced them to assume, and assumptions made people sloppy. So I went quiet. Not the defeated kind of quiet they expected, the kind that shrinks and waits. This was different. I listened more than I spoke. I nodded. I agreed when agreement cost me nothing. I let conversations roll past me without interruption, even when my name came up like a footnote. At first, they seemed relieved. My husband stopped watching me as closely. Lena grew more comfortable, her posture looser, her questions more direct. She started speaking openly about plans, about timelines, about what made sense going forward, as if I were no longer part of the equation. That was when I started to see everything. I noticed who spoke first when decisions were discussed, who waited, who glanced at whom before answering. I watched the way confidence shifted depending on the topic, how certain names made people tense and others made them relax. The family's unity, so solid on the surface, wasn't as seamless as it appeared. Fear has a smell. Once you recognize it, you notice it everywhere. One afternoon, his brother corrected himself mid-sentence, changing a date too quickly. Another time, his mother hesitated before answering a simple question about records she'd always been confident discussing. Small things. But patterns don't need to be loud to be real. Lena fascinated me the most. She wasn't careless. She was precise. She tracked conversations the way accountants track numbers, filing information away with quiet efficiency. She remembered details no one else bothered with, names, figures, timelines. When people spoke, she watched their faces more than their words. She wasn't there for affection. She was there for positioning. The longer I stayed silent, the more they mistook it for surrender. They stopped lowering their voices when I entered rooms. They spoke freely around me, confident I lacked the will or awareness to connect the dots. I became part of the furniture, useful only as a backdrop to their certainty. That misjudgment gave me my first real advantage. It came in the form of an inconsistency so small I almost dismissed it. A reference to a meeting that hadn't happened, or rather one I hadn't been told about. The dates didn't align. The explanation didn't fit. When I asked, casually, the response came too quickly, too polished. I didn't react. I didn't press. I stored it. From then on, I watched for those moments. Each one confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. They were moving fast, and speed always leaves traces. People forget what they've already told you. They contradict themselves when they believe no one is keeping score. I was keeping score. At night, when the house was quiet, I replayed conversations in my head, mapping who knew what and when. I resisted the urge to act. One piece of information wasn't enough. Timing mattered more than outrage. They needed to believe they were ahead. My silence fed that belief beautifully. My husband began treating me with a kind of careless patience, the way people do when they assume resistance has ended. Lena's confidence sharpened into entitlement. She corrected people openly now. She spoke as if outcomes were already decided. No one noticed me listening. There was a moment, standing in the hallway one evening, when I caught Lena watching me. Not with suspicion, but with something closer to curiosity. As if she were trying to decide whether I was truly done or simply slow to accept reality. I met her gaze calmly and looked away first. That seemed to satisfy her. What she didn't understand was that I wasn't retreating. I was observing. Silence wasn't my surrender. It was my surveillance. The more they relaxed, the more they revealed. A reference to a document that shouldn't exist. A timeline that shifted depending on who told it. A question asked too carefully, meant to test how much I knew. I answered those questions with vagueness, letting them draw their own conclusions. People always do. By then, the fear that had once kept me awake at night had changed shape. It wasn't gone, but it no longer paralyzed me. It sharpened my focus, turned my attention outward instead of inward. I wasn't asking what I'd done wrong anymore. I was asking what they were hiding. And I was patient. That patience unsettled them more than anger ever could. They mistook it for acceptance, for emotional exhaustion, for defeat. They didn't realize that every day they spoke freely in my presence, they were handing me another thread. I didn't know yet how many threads I would need. I only knew that when the time came to pull, I wanted the whole structure to unravel at once. They believed silence meant I had nothing left to say. What it meant was that I was finally listening. I found it on a morning when the house was empty and too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound feel exposed. I hadn't been looking for anything specific. That was the truth. I was putting papers away, returning a folder to the cabinet where it belonged, when I noticed a tab I hadn't seen before. The label was generic, intentionally so, but the weight of the folder was wrong, heavier, thicker, protected. I hesitated only a second before opening it. What I saw didn't shock me, it explained me. The documents weren't dramatic on their own, no confessions. No obvious crimes spelled out in bold. Just records layered carefully over time, entities nested inside entities, decisions dated years before I'd been told they existed. A legacy structure designed to look clean on the surface while hiding its seams underneath. And threaded through it all was the same omission. Me. My name appeared only where it limited access, restricted authority, or described potential interference. I wasn't a partner. I wasn't a stakeholder. I was a contingency. As I read, memories rearranged themselves. Conversations that had ended too quickly. Decisions that had felt rushed. The insistence on discretion, on keeping things within the family. It wasn't just about control going forward. It was about protecting something that predated me. That was the moment I understood why I had never been allowed into the inner circle. The secret wasn't recent. It had been buried long before I arrived, wrapped in tradition and quiet compliance. It tied together inheritance, reputation, and a compromise made years ago that no one wanted examined too closely. Everything I'd been excluded from suddenly made sense. They hadn't just underestimated me. They had designed the system to ensure I could never touch this. I closed the folder and sat down, my heart steady, my mind racing. This wasn't information you confronted someone with in anger. This was leverage that worked only if handled carefully. Too much exposure too fast would burn it. Used correctly, it would force them to choose between their narrative and their protection. I thought about Lena then, about how precisely she had been positioned, how quickly legal language had entered our home once she appeared. She wasn't just replacing me emotionally, she was shielding this structure from scrutiny, a controlled transition, a clean removal, my removal. The realization didn't make me feel powerful at first. It made me cautious. Secrets like this don't just collapse one relationship. They unravel systems, families, reputations that had taken decades to curate. That was why they were so certain I would never use it. They believed marriage made me loyal. Silence made me safe. They believed I wouldn't risk collateral damage, that I would prioritize harmony over truth, as I always had. They assumed I would protect them from themselves. They were wrong. Still, I didn't confront anyone. Not my husband. Not Lena. Not his family. The secret was only valuable as long as they believed it was still buried. I let them keep that belief. Instead, I began documenting quietly. Dates, references, who said what and when. I noted how often the same few names appeared across different records, how decisions aligned too neatly to be coincidence. I didn't copy anything. I didn't remove anything. I just learned it. And then I waited. The first sign that something had shifted came from his mother, of all people. She asked me one afternoon, too casually, whether I remembered a particular period from years ago, phrasing it as a nostalgic question. I answered vaguely, watching her eyes. She smiled, but her relief was too obvious. Lena started paying closer attention to me after that. Not openly, just enough to test. She asked what I thought about certain changes, about whether I felt comfortable with the direction things were going. I gave her nothing concrete. People get nervous when they don't know what you know. I could feel their confidence thinning, even as they pretended everything was under control. Questions were framed more carefully. Conversations paused again when I entered rooms, but this time the pause was charged with uncertainty. I didn't enjoy it. This wasn't about satisfaction. It was about timing. I spent evenings alone, not in despair but in preparation, understanding the full scope of what I had found. This secret wasn't a weapon I could swing wildly, it was a key. Used at the wrong moment, it would lock doors. Used at the right one, it would open everything. They believed they had removed me from the board, that I was no longer a variable worth considering. They thought my silence meant ignorance, resignation, fear. What they never realized was that silence had given me space to see clearly. By the time they moved forward with their plans, confident the ground beneath them was solid, I understood exactly how fragile it was. I knew which questions would destabilize the room, which documents would demand explanation, which timelines could not withstand scrutiny. I didn't need to threaten them, I didn't need to warn them. All I needed was the right moment to let the truth surface on its own, because when it did, it wouldn't protect them. It would expose them. And once that happened, there would be no going back. The first official letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, thin and impersonal, addressed to me like a formality rather than a person. The language was precise, rehearsed, stripped of anything human. It described the end of my marriage as if it were a logistical adjustment, a necessary reorganization. Reading it, I felt no shock, only a dull confirmation of what had already been unfolding for months. This version of events had been written long before the envelope ever reached my hands. They weren't asking me to respond, they were informing me. The narrative they presented was clean and efficient. I was described as a spouse with limited involvement, someone who had benefited from proximity to success, but had not materially contributed to it. There was no mention of years spent smoothing crises, managing details, absorbing pressure so others could appear unburdened. My absence from their story was complete and deliberate. When my husband finally spoke to me about it, he did so with practiced calm. He framed the legal process as unfortunate but necessary, something best handled quietly and quickly. He spoke about dignity, about minimizing disruption, about how hard this was for everyone involved, everyone except me. Lena hovered nearby during that conversation, not intruding, just present enough to be seen. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her confidence had hardened into entitlement. She moved through the house as if the transition were already complete, as if I were merely waiting for the paperwork to catch up. The settlement offer arrived shortly after. It was insultingly small, framed as generous. Enough to leave quietly, enough to avoid complications, enough, they believed, to make me grateful for mercy. The message beneath it was unmistakable. Accept this, or be erased publicly. I read it once, then folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. My hands didn't shake. By then, fear had given way to something steadier. Clarity. That evening, my husband found me in the kitchen and spoke softly, as if lowering his voice made his words kinder. He told me this was the best outcome I could expect. He said dragging things out would only make it worse. He spoke as though he were offering advice, not issuing a warning. I nodded. I thanked him for explaining. The relief on his face was immediate. They mistook my composure for surrender. They saw what they wanted to see, a woman exhausted by conflict, ready to accept whatever terms would make the discomfort end. Lena watched me closely that night, her gaze measuring, then easing when I didn't push back. Their confidence returned in full. What they didn't know was how much had already been done. While they drafted letters and rehearsed statements, I had been assembling my own quiet record. Timelines aligned, inconsistencies noted, questions prepared, not to ask them, but to ask the right person at the right time. I didn't announce any of it. I didn't threaten. I let them believe they were ahead. The night before the court hearing, the house was unusually calm. There were no whispered conversations, no urgent phone calls. They moved through the space with the ease of people who believed the outcome was secure. I packed nothing. I prepared nothing visible. I slept better than I had in months. In the morning, Lena dressed carefully, choosing something that signaled confidence without excess. My husband barely glanced at me as we left, already focused on the role he would play. His family arrived separately, united and unbothered, ready to watch the final act unfold. They had designed this case to finish me. The courtroom felt colder than I expected, the air heavy with formality. As we took our seats, I felt the familiar isolation return, but it no longer frightened me. Isolation, I had learned, was only dangerous when you didn't understand it. I understood it perfectly now. My husband's lawyer reviewed notes with casual assurance. Lena sat close, her posture relaxed, already imagining what came next. His family settled behind them, a picture of solidarity. They didn't look at me. Why would they? In their minds, this was already over. As the judge entered and proceedings began, I kept my eyes forward. I didn't watch my husband. I didn't watch Lena. I watched the room, the way confidence sat in bodies, the way certainty showed itself through carelessness. They spoke first, as expected. Their lawyer delivered the narrative smoothly, framing me as peripheral, emotional, irrelevant. The words washed over me without impact. I had heard them all before, just not in such a formal setting. When it was my turn to respond, I said very little. Enough to seem unprepared, enough to reinforce their assumptions. The judge nodded, made notes, then began reviewing the file. That was when the room slowed, when the familiar rhythm faltered, when pages were turned not quickly, but carefully. I felt my husband's confidence hesitate for the first time. By then, I knew exactly what would unsettle them. Not an accusation, not a dramatic reveal. Just a question, asked by the right person, in the right place, at the right moment. They believed this courtroom belonged to them, that it was built to confirm their version of events, to formalize a decision already made. I let them believe it all the way up to the moment the judge stopped reading. Because sometimes the most effective way to change the outcome is to let the other side build the stage themselves, and then wait for the lights to turn. The judge continued reading as if time had slowed to accommodate his attention, the pages turning with deliberate care instead of routine efficiency. The silence pressed down on the room. Not the expectant kind, but the uncomfortable kind. The kind that makes people aware of their own breathing. I sat still, hands folded, eyes forward. Across the aisle, my husband shifted slightly in his chair, a movement so small he probably thought no one noticed. I noticed. His lawyer cleared his throat and began to speak, launching into the familiar cadence of confidence. He outlined their position smoothly, as if reciting something he'd already practiced in front of a mirror. The marriage had broken down. The assets were straightforward. My role had been limited. The proposed settlement was fair. The words sounded polished, reassuring, final. The judge raised a hand, not abruptly, but enough to interrupt the flow. "One moment," he said without looking up. The lawyer paused, mid-sentence, and waited. The pause stretched longer than expected. When the judge finally looked up, his expression wasn't stern or skeptical. It was curious, which felt far more dangerous. He asked a question, a procedural one, precise, unexpected. The lawyer answered immediately, too immediately, his voice quick to fill the space. The judge nodded once, then asked a follow-up. This one narrower, more specific. The lawyer adjusted his explanation, adding details that hadn't been mentioned before. I felt the air in the room tighten. The judge looked back down at the file, flipping to a marked page. He traced a line with his finger, then turned another page, comparing dates. The courtroom remained silent, but it was no longer calm. It was alert. My husband leaned toward his lawyer and whispered something. Lena's posture changed, her shoulders pulling back as if bracing. For the first time, she looked confused. The judge spoke again, reading a sentence aloud. Just one. The language was technical, but the implication wasn't. He read it slowly, making sure it landed. Then he looked directly at my husband. "Can you explain this discrepancy?" he asked. The question was simple. The impact was not. My husband opened his mouth, then closed it. His lawyer stepped in, offering clarification, explaining context, reframing. The judge listened without interruption, his face unreadable. When the explanation ended, he asked for the document referenced, then another one, then a third. Confidence drained from the other side in visible stages. Lena glanced at my husband, then at the file, then back at the judge. Her earlier ease evaporated, replaced by something sharper. Concern. She shifted in her seat, no longer relaxed. The judge removed his glasses and set them on the bench. The sound was quiet, but it carried. He leaned back slightly, reviewing his notes, then leaned forward again. "There appears to be an inconsistency in how certain interests have been characterized," he said calmly, "and a timeline that requires clarification." No accusation, no raised voice, just fact. My husband's lawyer attempted to redirect, suggesting the matter could be addressed later. The judge shook his head once. "Now is appropriate," he said. He read another passage, this one longer, outlining language that conflicted with the narrative presented moments earlier. As he spoke, the room seemed to hold its breath. I felt something settle into place, a shift so subtle it would have been missed by anyone not watching closely. The stage was no longer theirs. The judge looked at me for the first time since the hearing began, not with sympathy, with recognition. "Mrs. Reynolds," he said, using my name deliberately, "do you have documentation that speaks to this issue?" I did not rush to answer. I met his gaze and nodded once. "Yes," I said. My voice was steady. "I do." A murmur rippled through the benches behind my husband. His family leaned toward one another, whispering urgently. Lena's face went pale. The judge turned back to my husband's counsel. "You'll have an opportunity to review what's been submitted," he said. "But I'm concerned by what I'm seeing here." Concern. That word landed harder than any accusation. He addressed the courtroom as a whole now, explaining that the matter before him extended beyond the surface dispute. That certain disclosures appeared incomplete. That further review was necessary before any ruling could be considered. The lawyer objected, politely but firmly. The judge acknowledged the objection, then overruled it. "I'm ordering a temporary hold on any asset transfers related to this case," he said, "effective immediately." My husband's head snapped up. Lena stared straight ahead, her jaw tight. The judge continued, his tone unchanged. He referenced oversight, due process, the importance of transparency. Each word stripped another layer of certainty from the other side. "This court will not proceed under assumptions," he said. "We will proceed under facts." He set a date for continued proceedings and directed both parties to submit additional documentation. As he spoke, I watched my husband's confidence collapse inward, replaced by something he hadn't expected to feel in that room. Exposure. When the gavel finally struck, the sound was sharp and final. Court was adjourned. As people stood, the energy in the room shifted again, this time decisively. Conversations erupted in hushed urgency. Lawyers leaned in. Phones appeared. Plans were being recalculated in real time. My husband looked at me then, really looked at me. His expression caught somewhere between anger and disbelief. Lena avoided my eyes entirely. I gathered my things slowly, deliberately. I didn't smile. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. They had come into that courtroom believing they were safe, believing the outcome was already written. What the judge had realized, and what they were only beginning to understand, was that the story they told didn't match the record. And once that happens, nothing stays controlled for long. The courtroom didn't erupt after the gavel fell. It fractured. People stayed seated for a beat too long, as if waiting for someone to tell them what this moment meant. My husband's lawyer leaned in close, speaking rapidly, his earlier composure replaced by urgency. His family clustered together, whispers sharp and panicked. Lena stood slightly apart now, her body angled away from him, as if distance might protect her from whatever was coming next. I remained where I was, watching the unraveling happen in real time. The judge returned to the bench sooner than expected, his expression unchanged, his presence alone enough to quiet the room again. He didn't waste time with ceremony. He went straight back to the file, now open wide, no longer treated as routine. He addressed the inconsistencies directly, naming dates, entities, language that conflicted with sworn statements. Each reference landed like a weight. My husband's lawyer attempted to interject, but the judge held up a hand. "I'm not asking for argument right now," he said evenly. "I'm asking for accuracy." Accuracy was the one thing they could no longer provide. As the judge spoke, I noticed the subtle shift in body language across the room. My husband's confidence, once so effortless, had collapsed into rigidity. His jaw tightened, his shoulders hunched forward. Lena's hands were clenched in her lap, her earlier polish gone, replaced by calculation that no longer knew where to land. The family's unity began to crack. One of them spoke out of turn, offering clarification that contradicted something said earlier. Another stayed silent when a response was clearly expected. The judge noted it all, his pen moving steadily across the page. Fear does that. It breaks coordination. The judge leaned back slightly, then forward again, asserting control with nothing more than posture and tone. He explained calmly that the court could not proceed under incomplete disclosure, that the matter before him extended beyond the dissolution of a marriage, that certain omissions raised concerns requiring immediate attention. He issued temporary orders without hesitation. Assets were to remain untouched, accounts frozen, no transfers, no restructuring, no quiet adjustments behind closed doors. He was precise, careful, leaving no room for interpretation. When he spoke my name again, it wasn't as a formality. "Mrs. Reynolds," he said, "you are to remain in full access to the marital residence pending further review." My husband's head snapped toward me. His mother inhaled sharply. Lena stared at the floor. The judge continued, now addressing my husband directly. He outlined expectations for transparency, for cooperation, for compliance. His tone never rose, but the authority in it was unmistakable. "This court does not look favorably on attempts to obscure material facts," he said, "and it does not reward them." That was when I saw it register fully on my husband's face. This wasn't a setback. This was a threat to the foundation he'd relied on his entire adult life. The system he trusted was no longer shielding him, it was examining him. Lena tried to speak once. Just once. The judge acknowledged her presence politely, then reminded her that she was not a party to the case and had no standing to address the court. The silence that followed was brutal. Her role evaporated in that moment, stripped of authority, relevance, protection. She sat back down, small for the first time since I'd known her. The judge concluded by setting the next hearing and outlining the scope of review. He referenced potential referrals, external oversight, consequences that extended far beyond family court. He didn't need to explain further. Everyone in that room understood exactly what he meant. When court adjourned again, this time for real, the energy was different, not chaotic, focused, calculating. As we stood, my husband turned toward me, his eyes sharp with anger and something else I hadn't expected. Fear. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then stopped. His lawyer placed a hand on his arm, guiding him away. His family followed, no longer unified, each person processing their own exposure. Lena hesitated, looking at him, then at me. For a moment I thought she might say something. She didn't. She walked out alone. I gathered my things slowly. No one rushed me. No one spoke to me. The space around me felt clear, as if the noise had finally moved somewhere else. Outside the courtroom, conversations erupted again, phones pressed to ears, plans forming and reforming. I stepped past it all, my body lighter than it had been in months. They hadn't lost because I attacked them. They lost because they hid, because they believed control meant silence and loyalty meant compliance, because they assumed I would protect what they built, even as they dismantled me. The judge hadn't shouted. He hadn't punished. He had simply refused to look away. And once that happens, once the truth is forced into the open, there's no amount of power that can push it back into hiding. The ruling wasn't final yet. There were still steps ahead. Still consequences to unfold. But as I walked away from the courthouse, I knew the most important shift had already happened. They no longer controlled the story. And they never would again. The courthouse doors closed behind me with a soft, final sound, and for the first time in months, the noise inside my head went quiet. Outside, the city moved on as if nothing monumental had happened. Cars passed. People laughed into their phones. A woman walked her dog past the steps without a glance at the building behind her. It struck me then how contained the chaos had been, how the moment that changed everything for me barely registered in the world beyond those walls. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. In the weeks that followed, the consequences unfolded without drama, but with precision. My husband complied because he had no choice. The confidence he once carried like armor disappeared, replaced by caution and calculation. Meetings were postponed, accounts scrutinized, questions asked that no one in his family had ever expected to answer. The family that once moved as a single body began to fragment. Phone calls went unanswered. Advice conflicted. The quiet certainty that had governed every decision cracked under scrutiny. They learned slowly and painfully that power only works when no one is looking too closely. Lena vanished from my daily life almost immediately. There were no dramatic exits, no confrontations in hallways. Her name simply stopped appearing. Her role, so carefully constructed, evaporated once the protection around it was gone. Without access or authority, she had nothing to stand on. I didn't take satisfaction in her absence. It wasn't about her. What mattered was what I chose not to take. I didn't chase humiliation. I didn't demand revenge disguised as justice. I protected myself. I protected the truth. And when the opportunity arose to push further than necessary, I didn't. Power used responsibly lasts longer than power seized in anger. The strangest part was how quickly space returned to my life once the pressure lifted. Mornings felt lighter. Decisions felt like mine again. I stopped bracing for conversations, stopped replaying words after they were spoken. I slept through the night. One afternoon, standing in the house that had once felt hostile, I realized it no longer held any authority over me. It was just a place, walls, light, air. I rearranged a room, not because someone suggested it, but because I wanted to. The choice felt small and enormous at the same time. That was the quiet victory. Not the orders issued or the assets protected, but the return of autonomy. The knowledge that I could occupy space without shrinking, that my voice didn't need to be loud to be effective, that dignity wasn't something anyone could grant or revoke. Looking back, I don't feel bitterness. I feel clarity. Silence had once erased me. Later, it protected me. The difference was intention. Silence that hides fear will consume you. Silence chosen with purpose can shift entire rooms. I learned that being underestimated isn't a weakness. It's a position, one you can use if you're patient enough. I think about the judge sometimes, not as a symbol of justice, but as a reminder of what happens when someone refuses to accept a convenient story. He didn't save me. He listened. And that was enough. If any part of this story feels familiar to you, if you've ever been pushed aside quietly or told to be flexible when what was really being asked of you was to disappear, know this. You're not imagining it. And you're not powerless. There is strength in paying attention. There is power in preparation. And there is nothing weak about choosing the moment you speak. If you've been through something like this, or if you're in the middle of it right now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your story in the comments if you feel comfortable. Sometimes seeing your experience reflected back can make all the difference. And if this resonated with you, stay with me. There are more stories here about justice, dignity, and the quiet ways people turn the tables when no one expects them to. Subscribe if you'd like to hear them, and thank you for listening all the way to the end. The judge spoke once that day. I found my voice long before that, and I intend to keep using it.